I was in this divisional forest office one day, and the divisional forest officer said, "Oh, well, you're this foreigner here studying our forests, and we have something really cool." This was in central India. He said, "We have a population of black buck here." And so he took me to this field and at dusk, and we saw the black buck. And it was the first time I'd seen a black buck. And black buck are beautiful animals. And so I was really excited, and we were driving back to the town. And I asked him, "Well, you're the DFO. What are you doing to manage this landscape for the black buck?" He said, "Oh, well, we're planning to put in some plantations in that area." And actually, you can see in the background, there's a teak plantation already. And then I got back and I had my copy of S.H. Prater, Mammals of India, and I opened it up and I found, well, black buck are not a forest antelope, they're a grassland antelope. So I started to think there's something really weird going on with the way we're thinking about plantations. You can see how different these government forest plantations look from a natural forest. And clearly, the plantation is a commercial operation, not a forest restoration operation. What they're actually doing is often planting, commercially valuable species that may not be the most important ecosystem species in ways that don't provide great ecosystem services. I mean, I think this is a story that's repeated all over India in slightly different forms. And there is a lot of monitoring of hectares planted. Now there's less so 15 years ago, but now there's a lot of monitoring of forest cover going on. There was some of that 15 years ago, and not really a monitoring of what are the local values that people have for this landscape? How are those being measured? How can we improve those? And as is very widely documented, the concerns of forest dwelling people or forest adjacent people were rarely considered. And actually, there's not very much consideration of ecology in a lot of these programs. Oftentimes, there's not really good thinking about plant communities in these programs. Summarizing, a lot of current Indian policies are not effective. Uh, I would say that a lot of these programs are badly designed or they're somewhat incoherent. And a key part of incoherence or badness is programs don't clearly articulate why are we doing this? Who are we trying to benefit by restoring forests in India? There's just a target, and this is what we hear when we talk to field officials. They just have to find places to plant trees because that's what their government wants. And if there's already trees there, well, we have to plant them. And if it's a rocky south-facing slope where trees aren't going to grow, well, we just have to plant trees because that's what our bosses want to see. And we found a lot of the spending was going towards areas where it was likely, according to our model, that tree cover would not survive. We usually think about restoration being about plant communities, but it might be about reconfiguring local politics and local relationships between government officials. And the examples I've given of effective restoration begin with understanding how people benefit from restoration, and they begin with an understanding of causal processes that contribute to restoration, which are not always about the plants. Sometimes they're about, providing people alternative fuel or changing the local governance arrangements. And they involve local people in program design and implementation, and they prioritize those local people's needs. We want to be thinking at a landscape scale, but we want to think less about tree coverage and more about the interaction between different native vegetation, which is not only trees, but also, grasslands and savannas and marshlands, and the values that people have in those landscapes. I mean, I'm impressed with the work we've seen recently that the Himachal Pradesh Forest Department is doing. We're seeing in that state a real shift over the last decade or two towards a more ecological and people-centered forest practice. I don't think that's true everywhere in India. We can build new programs, find new ways to empower local decision making. We probably want people to be able to profit off of forest lands. But we can often do it in a way that provides more benefits. We could imagine a system where we could get a lot of benefit from using the diverse native species of trees and not just focusing on, say, pine in the Himalayas or teak or sal or eucalyptus in the different regions of India where those are widely grown. Giving local people and local officials more power to design programs that work based on those local conditions would, in the long run, lead to better outcomes.
For several decades, India has attempted to restore forests and degraded landscapes through a range of policy instruments, from large-scale tree planting on government lands and law enforcement-driven conservation to community-based programs, compensatory afforestation initiatives such as CAMPA, and more recently, the Green Credits Program. Yet, despite the scale and ambition of these efforts, important questions remain about what this work is actually achieving, who benefits from it, and what kind of ecological and social futures these programs are forging. Drawing from extensive research in Himachal Pradesh and other parts of India, Dr. Fleischman's work examines the institutional and political dynamics that shape forest restoration policy and practice. His research asks us to think critically about why many restoration efforts struggle to meet ecological goals, why they can sometimes produce unintended consequences for local communities and landscapes, and what more grounded and effective alternatives might look like. Importantly, this talk also points toward possible pathways forward, including greater local authority in decision-making, more ecologically informed restoration goals, and approaches that integrate sustainable livelihoods alongside conservation objectives. These questions feel especially relevant in the Himalayan context today, where ecological vulnerability, climate pressures, and changing rural livelihoods are deeply intertwined. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Forrest Fleischman. Dr. Fleischman is an associate professor, as I mentioned, of environmental policy at the University of Minnesota. His research focuses on the institutional dynamics of forest policy, particularly forest restoration, and he has been studying forest and agroforestry policy in India since 2006, with field experience across the Himalayas, central India, and Kerala. In addition to his work in India, he has also conducted research in the United States, Mexico, Guatemala, Malawi, and South Africa, and has published nearly 50 peer-reviewed scientific papers across leading journals in the social and ecological sciences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Forrest Fleischman.
Thank you, Aashra. I just want to make sure, can you hear me? All right. So first of all, I want to say it's really an honor to be here. I've had the good fortune. Oh, I just realized that this picture that I put up there, you can see someone who got cut off in the background when I resized it. And that's actually Aashra in the background. Um, so uh, I've had the good fortune to work in India for almost 20 years, and I've had a lot of really great mentors across different parts of India, across different fields, who've taught me a lot. And so I want to acknowledge all these mentors I put on the first slide. I'll put some of them on the last slide. People who've taught me so much about India, which is obviously not my country, but which is a really interesting place to study forest restoration. Okay, there we go. So my plan for this talk is to begin by talking about how India or how forest restoration has been imagined in India over time, and then think a little bit about alternative ways of imagining the future of the landscape in India in which restoration could play a role. I'll then talk about my experiences studying restoration in India, which unfortunately have mostly been studying places where restoration fails, primarily looking at government tree planting schemes on government land. But then I'm going to talk, so that these will include my experiences in central India and Himachal Pradesh. Um, then I'm going to talk about some hopeful ways forward and some evidence about different practices that and ways of thinking about restoration that might be much more successful. And through this paper or through this talk, I want to give you the idea that restoration is actually a broader and maybe more difficult concept than we often think of it when we think of ecological restoration. Because when we think of ecological restoration, we often think of something like getting the right plant community in place for a particular habitat. But I want to suggest that actually restoring landscapes means restoring human environment interactions to being ones that are restorative and regenerative from being ones that are often destructive. And that requires not only rethinking plant communities, but also rethinking political, social, and economic relationships. So I'll try to do that in this talk. And I do want to foreground that I'm going to focus on evidence that I've produced through my research. And so I don't think this is an exhaustive list. And I noticed I got some questions in advance. Someone asked about the Forest Rights Act, and it just happens that I'm not going to talk about that, although I have some thoughts about it, because it turns out I've never studied it. So it's not that it's not an interesting, important topic. And we could come up with other topics where very relevant to this question of reshaping social and economic relationships for restoration, but I haven't studied them. So I want to begin with the idea that there's a long history of forest restoration in India. And from a historical perspective, what I can find is the first sort of hints of restoration type ideas that we can find in India come from the Ashokan edicts, which say that we're going to plant trees along roadsides to provide shade for travelers. And so already thousands of years ago, we have clear evidence that people were thinking about the role of trees in fostering productive human relationships. I'm sure it goes back further. That's just the one that we have very clear evidence for. But a widespread sense of India being a place of ecological degradation doesn't really appear that I can find in India until the British in the 19th century. And the British did a couple of important things. The first point I want to make is the British saw India from the standpoint of Britain, from the UK. And I put this picture up of Stonehenge in the UK as a reminder that the UK is a really different place than India. First of all, it's much wetter than much of the UK is much wetter than India. It's also much colder. And it's also much more deforested than India to this day and for a very long time. And the evidence suggests that widespread deforestation in the UK actually dates back to the time of Stonehenge. Um, so much older than those Ashokan edicts. So the British came to India with certain ideas and experiences that shaped how they saw the landscape. Of course, they started creating a government-owned forest estate in a way that hadn't existed previously. But they also looked at land that didn't have trees and said, oh, that's degradation. Because in the UK it was. Now, in India, there are landscapes in India that don't naturally have trees, but there aren't in the UK. Deforested landscapes in the UK are largely the result of or not forested landscapes in the UK are largely the result of this very long history of deforestation. The British also applied the term waste to land that did not generate tax or forest revenue. And originally, this was a taxation term. Waste was land that was wasted to the revenue department because it didn't generate revenue. It's not the same thing as saying it was ecologically degraded, but over time, the terms became synonymous. And the British talked a lot about the need to restore forests. They did pioneer some tree planting in some parts of India, um, largely as a part of sort of rotational silvicultural operations. Uh, Tree planting under the British, as far as records that I've been able to locate, was not very extensive. And we're working on a project right now where we're reading old British era working plans, and they just don't talk that much about planting trees. They do a little bit of it in a few places, but it's just not that important. Post-independence, a lot of things didn't change very much, but I want to highlight a couple things that did. The first is that the consolidation of government control over forest lands occurs post-independence when princely estates and zamindari forests are turned into government forests. Those were not all managed by the British prior to independence, but by the 1950s and 1960s, they were all managed by state forest departments. And then in 1952, the government came up with this forest policy, and people are probably aware of this, but this is where we get this idea that India should have 1/3 of its total land area under forests, and that 60% of the land in the Himalayas should be kept under forests. And that some of these wording have changed in subsequent forest policies, but this idea is still there and still plays a role in policymaking. So you might ask, where do these numbers come from? And the answer is you can go back and read the background report to the 1952 forest policy, which is not widely available, but I did find it once when I was in Dehradun in the FRI library. Um, and they basically say, well, we're going to look at different regions of the world and what percent of their land is under forests. And at that time, 1951 or something like that, about 40% of Europe was forested, and about 33% of North America was forested, and other regions of the world had other percentages. And the report says, well, the wealthy regions of the world have about 1/3 forests. So if we want to be wealthy, we should be about 1/3 forests too. It's a leap of logic that makes no sense. But that's what the evidence we have of where this number of 1/3 came from. I want to point out that a colleague of mine, Pushpendra Rana, did an analysis of the state of Himachal Pradesh, how much of Himachal Pradesh's land could be forested. And we have to recognize there's some reservoirs, those can't be forested. A large portion of the land is high altitude desert or very high altitude above tree line, can't be forested. And then a large proportion of Himachal Pradesh is private agricultural land that's intensively farmed. And they came up with a maximum uh, potential forest land, forest cover of Himachal, assuming that agricultural land wouldn't be forested, of about 31%. I haven't seen similar exercises done for other parts of India, but I want to make this point because this goal that's enshrined in policy and that's often talked about in policy documents in India probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, India has, as last time I checked, about 22% forest cover, which is pretty impressive given that some parts of India are not naturally forested. And India, in terms of large countries, there's no other large country that's as intensively farmed as India. If you look at, say, China or the US or even most parts of Europe, they have a lower percentage of their land under intensively farming agriculture. So when did we start actually getting sort of large scale action toward forest restoration? Well, from what I have been able to trace, we really start to see this in the 1970s and 80s. In these working plans, if you go back to working plans, say from the 1950s and 60s, there's still not a lot of mention of reforestation. Starting around the 1970s, we see a lot. And there were several reasons that this focus came in at that time. One was a recognition that there had been a lot of government sanctioned conversion of forest land to agriculture, and we needed to conserve the remaining forests. Um, so in early post-independence, and certainly in the British era, the government encouraged farmers to go into forest areas, clear land, and create farms. So this was a shift towards an idea of no, we need to conserve and restore. And there were these ideas of Himalayan degradation, of a wood fuel crisis that was facing farmers. So these ideas facilitated the idea that we needed to restore lands, that we needed to provide more wood fuel. And there's a 1976 National Agriculture Commission report on forests that is really interesting because it was apparently pretty influential at the time. And it says, well, we looked at industrial roundwood production from Indian forests, and it's really low compared to peer countries. So India's forests are not producing the way other forests produce. Remember, they're talking about industrial roundwood, so lumber going to a mill. And so they said, well, what we need to do is cut down all these native forests and replace them with industrial tree planting programs. Now, I want to point out they're looking at industrial roundwood production, and they're not looking at how are forests used. And of course, India's forests were and still are used in lots of other ways that maybe some of these peer countries' forests were not being used by local people producing local needs that were not being captured in these statistics, and maybe the cause of this so-called unproductivity. So it's really a measurement failure. So programs in the 1970s and 80s focused on planting trees on degraded land using species that were easy to grow quickly. So in Himachal Pradesh, we've documented a real focus on cheer pine. Why cheer pine? Easy to grow in a nursery. Cattle won't eat it once you plant it outside. Grows quickly, creates forest cover quickly. In other parts of India, eucalyptus was widely planted, and other species. Um, Evaluations from that time uh, were pretty negative. And I put the cover of a couple old books that talked about this, that looked at these programs and found they weren't really working very well. Um, But a lot of evaluations that I've found were not rigorous enough to give confidence in understanding the overall impacts, or were fairly short term. And I want to highlight this great book by N.C. Saxena, India's Eucalyptus Craze, The God That Failed. And he studies eucalyptus, I think, as I recall, primarily eucalyptus production on private lands, and finds that it's not producing the results that people had anticipated. So it's the God that failed. On the other hand, we know that today there's lots of eucalyptus growing on Indian land. So maybe this story that it failed is not the complete story. Okay. So I want to highlight that there's a lot of newer trends since the 1980s in large-scale forest restoration, which include various restrictions on harvesting trees or conversion, which might be having negative implications because they might make it less desirable for people to invest in restoration. We have, of course, joint forest management, which was largely conceived, if you go back to the documents from the early 1990s when joint forest management was this pioneering new program. It was seen as a tool to encourage reforestation. Um, and CAMPA, which I'm not going to talk about a whole lot, we are trying to do some systematic evaluation of CAMPA, but I'll highlight that it's a program that doesn't make very much sense. And if you want to ask questions about what we're doing with that, I can try to answer them later. Commonalities across these imaginaries that all these programs have is why exactly we're restoring forests is not often articulated very clearly. There's this goal, we want to have more forest, but why do we want to have more forest? We're focused on an area of coverage of forest. We're not always thinking about what exactly do we want out of the forest. So I talk about what are the values that we care about that are leading us to want forests. And as is very widely documented, the concerns of forest dwelling people or forest adjacent people were rarely considered. And something that surprised me also is actually there's not very much consideration of ecology in a lot of these programs. So even my idea, restoration is about thinking about plant communities. Oftentimes, there's not really good thinking about plant communities in these programs. For example, extensive planting of cheer pine. Cheer pine is a native tree to the Western Himalayas, but has a role in the ecosystem. It's not the only tree in the ecosystem. Um, So, thinking about alternatives, um, we might think about explicitly considering why are we doing this? Why do we want forests? And why we want them is usually because they bring some benefits to people at different scales. And we want to think about that why. What are the benefits? We want to be thinking at a landscape scale and thinking about having productive landscapes. And this is probably part of the why, but we want to think less about tree coverage and more about the interaction between different native vegetation, which is not only trees, but also, grasslands and savannas and marshlands, and the values that people have in those landscapes. Um, we also want to be thinking about what's going on agricultural lands, which in these examples that I've illustrated are often ignored. We want to have governance arrangements that prioritize local power and local values and explicitly think about trade-offs and potential conflicts. All right, I want to shift gears to my empirical work, and I want to talk a little bit about how I ended up studying restoration. Um, I, uh, you may be wondering why this white guy from the United States is studying restoration in India, and there's maybe a longer backstory than what I want to get into in this talk. But I did end up having the wonderful good fortune to spend a year living in Kerala in 2006 and 2007. I got to apprentice at, or study basically at the Kerala Agricultural University College of Forestry, um, and work with B. Mohan Kumar, who's a wonderful expert on agroforestry. I then got interested in central India, and I ended up doing my doctoral work in central India. And I won't go into everything I was doing in my doctoral work. It wasn't supposed to be about restoration, but I had these experiences, and I'll give an example. I was in this divisional forest office one day, and the divisional forest officer, who's this older fellow in the blue-green shirt in the middle, said, "Oh, well, you're this foreigner here studying our forests, and we have something really cool." This was in central India. He said, "We have a population of black buck here." And so he took me to this field and at dusk, and we saw the black buck. And it was the first time I'd seen a black buck. And black buck are beautiful animals. And so I was really excited, and we were driving back to the town. And I asked him, "Well, you're the DFO. What are you doing to manage this landscape for the black buck?" He said, "Oh, well, we're planning to put in some plantations in that area." And actually, you can see in the background, there's a teak plantation already. And then I got back and I had my copy of S.H. Prater, Mammals of India, and I opened it up and I read this phrase that I put here. And I found, well, black buck are not a forest antelope, they're a grassland antelope. So I started to think there's something really weird going on with the way we're thinking about plantations. So I wrote a whole paper, and what I found is that when you ask foresters, why are you planting trees here? They'll talk about, well, we're a scientific bureaucracy. We have a working plan, we follow forest science, and tree planting is a part of that. But then I started probing further, and I'd look at these uh, at these working plans, and they didn't exactly say where they were going to plant trees. They didn't exactly say what trees they were going to plant. Well, why are you planting trees in this spot? I would ask. And this guy said, "Well, we follow the schemes." Oh, yeah, the schemes aren't mentioned in the working plan, but that's what we actually do. And then he said, "Don't worry too much about the working plan." And I love this. He said, "At least you've read. I haven't read it." Oh, that's interesting. So they're saying that they're doing the scientific thing, but then when you actually start probing on the ground what's actually going on, they're not following it. They're following schemes. So then I tried to understand, and I'm still trying to understand, almost 20 years later, what are these schemes that are leading to tree planting programs? So the official justification of these tree planting programs was, well, we're going to improve. Uh, oh, this. there's some repetition on this slide for some reason. We're going to improve the provision of ecosystem services. This is going to lead to poverty reduction, restoration, species conservation. But what they're actually doing is often planting, commercially valuable species that may not be the most important ecosystem species in ways that don't provide great ecosystem services. And we can see this in this example. These are photographs from, I believe, Adilabad. And you can see how different these government forest plantations look from a natural forest. And clearly, the plantation is a commercial operation, not a forest restoration operation. So in this paper, which is now quite old, I talked about the reason that foresters are doing this, and I found, well, uh, the officials are doing this because tree planting is something that gets monitored by their bosses. And you can see in these pictures I took, these are bosses coming and monitoring, and they can see if the tree plantation was put in, if it's growing. Other things like, are you working well with the community? It's kind of hard to know. Are you being effective at stopping poaching? Well, kind of hard to know, but you can see those trees. It's very clear and provides very easy to monitor indicators for a bureaucracy. And there's also these professional values and norms that have been adopted in the forest department. And the foresters I interviewed, again, this is 15 years ago, so things may have changed, but really had this belief that, well, these tree planting programs, like this example here where they're bulldozing a scrub forest kind of near Hyderabad and to put in a eucalyptus plantation, um, these are valuable. We're doing something good for society, and they really believe that. And these norms were coming from this monitoring, but also from the way they were trained and from what was actually getting evaluated about their work. And there is a lot of monitoring of hectares planted. Now there's less so 15 years ago, but now there's a lot of monitoring of forest cover going on. There was some of that 15 years ago. And not really a monitoring of what are the local values that people have for this landscape? How are those being measured? How can we improve those? So, shifting gears to Himachal, I had the opportunity, starting in 2017, to run actually now several studies in Himachal, focusing mostly on Kangra district. And if you're interested, I can explain why we ended up there. Um, very different forest type from central India. But we were able to locate really good records showing that, as I highlighted, particularly in the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s, there was a ton of tree planting going on. And this is great because, now it's 20, 30, 40 years after those trees were planted. We can really measure the outcomes. One of the things we found very early on talking to people is that tree planting wasn't good for everyone. There's some people who talked about benefits. They said, oh, there's more firewood. But a group of people who we talked to who were really upset about tree planting were the Gadis. These people are traditionally migratory herders of sheep and goats, moving up the altitudes. And they found that plantations were literally obstructing their migratory routes, like they can't move their sheep because there's a fence, because there's a plantation, and also decreasing fodder availability. Um, Now, I want to emphasize this is a complicated story. We often found that Gadi households were doing quite well, even though tree planting was harming their pastoral livelihoods, largely because many of them were shifting out of primary dependence on pastoralism. We also looked at, well, what happens to the land cover after plantation? And this is a chart that no one ever sees because it's in the supplementary information of one of our papers. But these are trajectories of individual plantation sites that we studied, looking at the forest canopy cover across those sites. And you see over here, you see a couple examples. Tree cover is declining, And then the plantation comes in the year of this dotted line, and tree cover increases. That's what we'd like to see. Um, you see that again here. Tree cover is declining, then it increases. But ooh, on this one it was declining and then it kept declining. Um, and let's see. On this one, the plantation happened in 1980. We didn't have any imagery from pre-1980, but you see cover declined and then increased. It has nothing to do with the plantation. It's all things that happened after it was planted. Uh, sorry, I'm just trying to move the window where I see the, oh, I can minimize this. And on this one, and this one, and this one, cover declined after planting. So we averaged all those curves together, and we get this graph, these two graphs here, which show year zero is the year of the plantation. And what does the canopy cover look like uh, before and after the plantation? And basically, what you're seeing is a straight line. So does this mean the plantations failed? Well, not exactly. This top graph is telling us plantations are not a driver of land cover change. Land cover change is not changing very much in this land cover is not changing very much in this landscape, and planting trees doesn't change that. But planting trees does have an impact on the percent classified as broadleaf cover. Why is that? Well, we know they were planting a lot of cheer pine. I've mentioned that a few times. And after the year of plantation, broadleaf cover declines over time as these cheer pines grow up. Maybe the cheer pines are actually being planted in areas that are already forested with broadleaf and replacing them. And in fact, this is what we found. This is a different data set, a different time period. Looking at plantations from 2016 to 2019, we found that a lot of plantations, almost 40%, were in areas that already had dense forest cover. There could be a good reason for this, like maybe they're going back into these old cheer pine plantations and planting broadleaf trees because they've recognized that they don't just want to have cheer pine. A lot of planting was going in non-forest areas. This could be because those are the areas that need to be reforested. But in both cases, these could mean there's just a target, and this is what we hear when we talk to field officials. They just have to find places to plant trees because that's what their government wants. And if there's already trees there, well, we have to plant them. And if it's a rocky south-facing slope where trees aren't going to grow, well, we just have to plant trees because that's what our bosses want to see. And we found a lot of the spending was going towards areas where it was likely, according to our model, that tree cover would not survive. So we can do better than this, and I think I'm getting a little short on time, but I really want to talk about examples we've seen of better outcomes. So this is actually the same data set I showed with those graphs showing change over time in individual plantations. And we published that paper in 2021, but we wanted to do more. We reanalyzed the data. It was kind of hard to do. Um, we had a hard time figuring out how to model this, but we tried to look at, well, why in some cases does plantation clearly does have an impact and some it doesn't. So we're giving this average effect of zero, but we're seeing variation in outcomes. What explains that variation? And we looked at a lot of different variables, and only one variable mattered. And this was a variable that we called continuous participation. Now, I don't want you to get too excited about what that means. I'll tell you exactly how we measured continuous participation. Continuous participation means the people in the village near that plantation reported that they were involved in planning the plantation. If that only that existed, we call that initial participation, and that actually has a slightly negative but statistically non-significant effect. And at the time that we visited the plantation, which might be 10, 20, 30 years after, people were still actively involved in managing that plantation. We call that continuous participation. where there was continuous participation, there was a statistically better trend in forest canopy. Um, so this could mean that continuous participation leads to better forest outcomes. It could also mean, and I want to be clear, this is not a causal model. So it could actually mean that, well, people only manage plantation areas that have been successful. Where the plantation totally failed, they're not involved in managing anymore. But this implies that having this long-term impact, long-term participation in planning, managing, and benefiting from plantation might be a key factor in leading to better outcomes. Now, I want to point out the biggest program in India that's tried to do this is called joint forest management. Joint forest management has existed all over India since the 1990s, and it's supposed to be about getting local people involved in managing, to some extent, their forest land. I know there's lots of flaws with joint forest management, but I just want to point out we had joint forest management as a variable in this model. Um, and first of all, it doesn't necessarily lead to participation. And second of all, it wasn't statistically significant. So we did not find joint forest management worked. We found when there's actual participation, it has an impact. So we can build new programs, find new ways to empower local decision making. And this is something that my research now, some of the work I'm working with Aashra, who introduced me, is trying to figure out, well, what are the things that are actually motivating people to participate? The Himachal Pradesh government, these recent pictures I took last summer in Himachal, including this one, uh, they are implementing a trial of a program that gives planting authority over to Mahila Mandals. So maybe that's a way to be more effective than these old joint forest management programs that didn't work. You know, there was a question about forest rights. Maybe community forest rights can be a way to get people more involved in participating in forested landscapes. Um, so maybe nowadays in Himachal, we're also working on developing app-based tools that'll give better recommendations to people about where and what to plant. Uh, Recommendations to forest guards and forest officials so that they're making maybe better informed decisions. So there's all kinds of ways that we could think about empowering local decision making over government forest lands and maybe also over other kinds of lands and communities where people would like to have more trees. Another thing that we can do is improve people's living standards. Now, this is not my work, but I like this paper a lot. A former postdoc of mine worked on it. Um, this is from Ruth DeFries's research in central India, very big sample size. And they found that when people in central India are provided with alternative energy for cooking, this is basically the Ujwala scheme, or alternative house building materials. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the program that they were evaluating there. There is less deforestation near those villages. Um, so this could be a very impactful way to do restoration. It is not the way we usually think about restoration. And remember what I said, we usually think about restoration being about plant communities, but it might be about reconfiguring local politics and local relationships between government officials. It might be about reconfiguring um, household fuel sources. The Ujwala scheme was not a forest restoration scheme. It was a public health scheme, really. But it has, in central India, it's been shown to have very beneficial effects on forest restoration. We also shouldn't assume that it'll have the same effect everywhere. I would anticipate the impact being much less in a place like the Himalayas because a lot of wood there is burned for home heating in the winter where it gets pretty cold, which is not so much of a problem in Madhya Pradesh or Maharashtra where it doesn't get as cold in the winter. So a higher percentage of the wood energy being used in the Himalayas is probably being used for home heating, and there are alternative home heating technologies that don't rely on wood I now, being a wealthy American, have a heat pump, which is a very expensive tool that requires very little energy. Um, so there are alternatives, but they're not as easy as something like the Ujwala scheme. I also want to point out I've been talking primarily about tree cover in government forest lands because a lot of my research has been about that. But the much of India's potential future carbon storage, more than half of it, is from agroforestry. And I'm getting this from Trisha Gopalakrishna's 2022 paper. And we have found that many of these areas with agroforestry potential coincide with areas of high poverty, where agroforestry investment might benefit the poor. Um, there's clear potential for increased carbon storage from agroforestry, for improved livelihoods from agroforestry. The livelihoods evidence base that we reviewed, this is this Choksi et al. 2025 paper. We found almost all the publications reporting increases in in livelihood. That's the green color in these different plantations, in these different agroforestry schemes. Or sorry, I'm speaking badly. In these different agroforestry kinds of practices, most of them are green, meaning most of them are leading to improvements in well-being. But a lot of the research designs were very poor. And in particular, we found very few papers that compare, say, if you add trees into your paddy field system, is the household better off because of that? And I would say we don't have good evidence about that. Although we do know people make money from the trees. We don't know, do they make more money than they would have if they had just been growing annual crops? That was not available in the evidence we reviewed. Unfortunately, we're going in the wrong direction. Large trees are actually declining in Indian farmlands. I also want to point out that uh, I'm super enthusiastic about agroforestry, but we should be really clear that agroforestry provides a distinct suite of benefits to natural forests. Um, they're probably more beneficial to the local people. They can be done on land that's private farmland where people need to make a profit. They need to have their subsistence from that land or their livelihood from that land. They're likely, in most cases, to provide lower levels of ecosystem services like carbon storage or wildlife habitat than natural forests. And they often require a lot of inputs, although less inputs than maybe your rice paddy or your wheat field. And there is a long-term trend of replacing natural forest cover with planted and intensively managed trees. And there's potential trade-offs between investment in agroforestry and natural forests. So I think we should be doing both of these things, but we should also be very cognizant that they are different. Current Indian government programs do not do a great job of supporting agroforestry. So we just published this paper looking at the impact of 8 government programs on tree cover outside of forests in India. And of these 8 government programs we looked at, only one, the submission on agroforestry, is associated with a positive impact on tree cover outside of forests. And programs like CAMPA and REGA, the Green India Mission, the National Horticulture Mission, are actually associated with decline in tree cover outside of forests in some of our models. So these programs may be harmful to tree cover, not beneficial. So we need to maybe rethink how we're doing this, these programs, and rethink some sort of broad elements of agroforestry and anti-poverty policy if we really want to support trees on farms as part of restoration. So I think this might be my last slide. Summarizing, a lot of current Indian policies are not effective. Uh, I would say that a lot of these programs are badly designed or they're somewhat incoherent. I would call CAMPA an example of an incoherent policy. And a key part of incoherence or badness is programs don't clearly articulate why are we doing this? Who are we trying to benefit by restoring forests in India? And when we do that, we say, then we can start saying, here are the ways that we can sell those benefits and get people on board with these programs. Here are the ways, the mechanisms through which we can get higher forest cover, better quality forests. And the examples I've given of effective restoration begin with understanding how people benefit from restoration, and they begin with an understanding of causal processes that contribute to restoration, which are not always about the plants. Sometimes they're about, providing people alternative fuel or changing the local governance arrangements. And they involve local people in program design and implementation, and they prioritize those local people's needs. And again, I said this on the first slide, but these are my ideas. I don't want other people to be blamed for my bad ideas and my errors, but I've learned so much from all of these people who've helped me understand India, understand agroforestry, understand forest management. So I just want to highlight all of their contributions and help in this work. And I
Hi,
see that there's questions in the Q&A. I don't know how we want to do that.
hi, Forrest. I just want to say thank you so much for such a um, enlightening and also very heavy talk. You've touched on a lot of different aspects of not only like restoration policy, but um, what the implications of that are from a social, from a societal point of view, and an ecological point of view. As the host, I can sort of direct questions to you if that helps.
Great.
And we
Yeah,
have,
that would help.
yeah.
I see there's a lot, so it's hard to read them. Maybe you can select.
Absolutely. So before we dive into questions, we have one comment from Navneel Neeraj, who says, Dr. Fleischman, I hope you are aware of the history surrounding Wilson of Derry from 1817 to 1883 and the extensive felling of native trees that began during his time. It is also important to note that over the years, the British gradually replaced native oak forests in Uttarakhand with pine plantations for commercial purposes. This shift, while economically motivated, eventually resulted in significant ecological damage to the region. Sadly, planting local native trees has still not found much traction.
Yes. I mean, I think this is a story that's repeated all over India in slightly different forms. And uh, I do want to say, I think that we run a danger when we condemn commercial forestry operations. In many parts of the world, although I would say not so much in India, commercial forestry is what sustains forest cover and forest habitat. So for example, where I live in the US, we have a lot of forest land because managing forest land is profitable to the state or to private forest landowners. So I think we have to be careful of not saying commercial forestry is bad. Um, we probably want people to be able to profit off of forest lands. But we can often do it in a way that provides more benefits. And in the example, replacing, why do we want pine instead of oak? I'm not that familiar with in Himalayan oaks being used as wood in the wood products industry, but elsewhere in the world, oaks are some of the most valuable timber species. So we could imagine a system where we could get a lot of benefit from using the diverse native species of trees and not just focusing on, say, pine in the Himalayas or teak or sal or eucalyptus in the different regions of India where those are widely grown.
A question from Rajat Bisani. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. How would you compare tree plantation projects undertaken by forest departments versus NGOs or CSRs?
Well, I should say up front that I've never studied the NGO and CSR world, so I don't know. I think you will find more variation in them. There's well-publicized examples of NGOs doing really amazing forest restoration work in different parts of India. Um, I worry that there's also a lot of examples of um, groups of people, be they NGOs or CSRs, uh, following very naive, sort of trendy practices. I'm thinking of these, what are they called? Miyawaki forests that seem to be very trendy these days in India and some other parts of the world, but don't seem to have actually the benefits that people attribute them to, and maybe a much more expensive and difficult way of achieving restoration goals. Similarly, I worry that a lot of CSR money goes into basically establishing commercial plantations, and it's not actually CSR, it's just a commercial enterprise. But because they're planting trees, they call it CSR. But I will say clearly up front, I haven't studied that, so I don't know that, but I think that there's sort of more variance. I think forest department work, um, I mean, I'm impressed with the work we've seen recently that the Himachal Pradesh Forest Department is doing. We're seeing in that state a real shift over the last decade or two towards a more ecological and people-centered forest practice. I don't think that's true everywhere in India, but the Forest Department is a little more consistent in what it does, and maybe that means it's neither the wonderful nor the worst example.
Mhm. Thank you. Um, Garima Gupta has a question. If I am not wrong, joint forest management was not very inclusive and was trying to take over already existing community forest governance systems such as Van Panchayats in Uttarakhand. What would, but it would be great to hear your perspectives on JFM and whether that was a good initiative.
Okay, I mean, this one is complicated. So, I mean, I'll begin by saying there are many places where JFM was exactly what you described, where it was the government taking over pre-existing institutional arrangements and making them more centralized and less inclusive. Um, there are also many places that JFM came in and was the first time where the government did anything inclusive at all. So Uttarakhand is a little unusual in the India-wide context in that it already had panchayats. But when I worked in Vidarbha and Telangana 15 years ago, um, it was clear that when JFM arrived in the early 1990s, it was a shift that was beneficial in terms of involving more people. On the other hand, it was never very effective because it was always implemented in a sort of large program blueprint fashion. And so while there were places in Maharashtra and Telangana I found where there had been really effective JFM, it often didn't survive very long because it would depend on one DFO or one range officer doing a good job in the local communities. And when they were transferred, it would just become the same blueprint it had always been. So I think it's very difficult to build co-management in a blueprint way. And I think that one of the reasons you got these failures, like you're describing in Uttarakhand, is uh, just this idea that we need to apply the same blueprint everywhere in India. And I would say if I were rethinking what was done with JFM, I would say it needs something totally different probably needs to be done in at least every state, if not every district of India, because there's so much ecological variability, there's so much social variability, there's so much historical variability, and giving local people and local officials more power to design programs that work based on those local conditions would, in the long run, lead to better outcomes. The last thing I'll say about this is in Himachal, which I will say is an unusual state, we didn't find JFM mattered, but we found local participation did. And to me, there's a lesson there, which is local political empowerment is important. And you don't necessarily get local political empowerment from having a program that uh, that formalizes that local people can be involved in things. But you do get local political empowerment from things that happened in Himachal, which include competitive electoral politics, high levels of education, and a number of other things that have enabled local people in Himachal to actually have an influence on government processes in a way that at least maybe I saw in Kerala many years ago, but I did not see when I was in Vidarbha and Telangana.
Mhm. Um, Thank you. Just before we move forward, Forrest, if you could stop sharing your screen, unless
Oh
you're
yeah.
planning to refer back to it.
No, I will.
And a second point is we have over 25 lovely questions, but unfortunately, we are not going to be able to attend to all of them today. Um, Maybe there could be a way to connect with Forrest and
Yeah.
follow up, but I'm going to quickly run through at least five more. I think we'll stick to five more, if that's okay with you,
Yeah.
Forrest.
Yes, absolutely.
We have a question from Krutarth Patel. How do we distinguish between ecological restoration and ecological simplification when plantation programs increase canopy cover but reduce native biodiversity and local grazing access?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think one of the challenges we've faced uh, we faced challenges trying to publish some of this research because people said, well, what you're describing isn't restoration, it's commercial forestry. Um, and our response was, well, but the forest department doesn't say they're doing, in fact, there is no commercial forestry in Himachal Pradesh. The forest department says they're doing this because they're improving the forest. And obviously, we found that that wasn't the case. Um, I would focus not on the name because I think anyone can say they're doing restoration and do anything. But I would focus on the phrasing that I used in the presentation is what are the values we're trying to realize here? And what is the value of increased canopy cover? I don't know, but I can tell you, okay, there's a value in increased provision of wood products, or there's a value in increased provision of fodder, or there's a value in increased wildlife habitat, or there's a value in increased biodiversity. And we can talk about those values in particular. We're restoring biodiversity. Okay, you're restoring canopy cover. Why? What exactly about canopy cover do you think is good other than, I mean, I can give you some answers that are very cynical, like, oh, it looks good when we publish our report that gets sent to the UN at the end of the year, that says that we increased our forest cover in our country. But it's not benefiting anyone unless we're particular about those values. So I think that being explicit about what value we're producing when we do restoration is really important.
Thank you. We have one more question from Kavya Jeevan. She says, I totally agree that the continuous participation of people has a significant effect on the success of restoration programs. During her fieldwork in Kerala among community conserved forest patches, she observed that local communities had initiated restoration efforts, but they often preferred species with economic or medicinal value rather than native species of the region. How do you think communities can be encouraged to include native species in restoration efforts? Offering incentives have also proved as an effective mechanism. Carbon credits might be an encouragement, but still the interest will move towards the fast-growing species. Do you think the emergence of biodiversity finance will be a hope for the current scenario?
Okay, there's a few pieces in there. I'll start with the finance piece. Um, I think that biodiversity finance and carbon credits are never going to work very well. There's lots of flaws. That's another conversation. They're very complicated instruments that have been around for a long time and have never worked well anywhere. To the extent that they have worked well, they've worked well in places where they measure very simple things that are easy to compare. So I don't have a lot of hope for them as being important and transformative um, uh, uh, impacts. Um, they may make a difference in some individual sites. Okay, how do we get people to value different species? I think that this goes back to what is the value there's two pieces. What is the value we're creating, and what's people's knowledge about what's useful to them? Um, I personally planted trees in my backyard this year. I live in a city. I have like a backyard. It's maybe 15 meters wide by 30 meters long or something like that. It's enough to have a little garden. And I did not plant trees. I planted apples and peaches because they're beautiful and give yummy fruit. So I think it's very reasonable for people to have those kind of preferences. Those were my preferences when I had a choice of what I could put on my property. So we could say, well, if we provide incentives, people might plant other things. Another thing is, can we provide people with knowledge about benefits that they might get from species? Um, it's not always the case, but there might be some species that have a lot of benefits to people, but people are less attuned to those benefits. Sometimes, as an example, sometimes I've seen in different parts of the world, people prefer to eat the fruit that they think are what the people in the city prefer. But maybe there's some native wild fruits that are really good. Um, here's an example. I used to live in a different part of the United States, and we had a native persimmon fruit. And it was so tasty, and you couldn't find them in markets. You had to like go in the forest and find a tree. It's not a very common tree, and like harvest them for yourself. And people just weren't very aware of them. Like if people were more aware of them, maybe they would want more of them. But except for, if you'd meet some people who grew up really out in the country and were old, they'd be like, oh yeah, this is a really good thing. But like young people wouldn't know about them. So there might be opportunities to spread knowledge. I don't know about the particular communities you're working in, but in some places there might be people aren't that aware of these benefits from these trees. And then finally, I think that there needs to be some thinking about sort of zonation. And near people's homes, people are going to want trees that are produce very direct benefits. But maybe farther away, there might be a benefit just to have some forest trees there.
Thank you. We have two questions from Abhishek Tiwari, who says, wonderful presentation with lots of evidence. He has worked in central India and Himalayan landscapes. His first question is, what were your observations regarding enablers of people's sustained participation as it was independent of JFMC? And his second question, assuming Ujjwala scheme and improved economic conditions lead to lesser decline in forests, are we suggesting that forest-dependent livelihoods are a threat?
Okay. Um, yeah, okay. Let's see. We are still trying to understand what leads to long-term local participation. Um, we have a PhD student now, I'm on her PhD committee, but she's working on a PhD in Sweden, Dwani Lalai, and that's kind of one of the focuses of her work. Um, I, I I find it a little puzzling, and it wasn't something we had collected data on, so I don't have a good answer. I suspect that you'd find something similar to the idea, um, you know, if you look at small businesses, some of them are successful and some of them aren't. And why? Well, maybe, that person was more ambitious. So maybe we have some differences in local leadership, something like that. But I don't really know. Um, and I wish I could say more about that. I think that we have a pretty clear answer that the JFM model of sort of large scale train the forest guards to work with local people and have them make plans and have the plans be basically photocopies. That didn't really succeed. And so I think we need to think differently about how we get there. And as I said, that's something we're still trying to do research on. If there are people here who are students who might pursue research, I think that's a really productive area. Sorry, what was the second piece of the question?
I'm just tracking it down once again.
Yeah, sorry, I resolved that question.
I see that one. Thanks. The second question is, assuming Ujjwala scheme and improved economic conditions lead to lesser decline in forests, are we suggesting that forest-dependent livelihoods are a threat?
Yes. So I think that this is another one of those, there's a lot of variation. And just knowing, having worked in three parts of India, and I've traveled a bit to other parts of India, and then more recently I've gotten to work in all these other countries. There are places where forest-dependent livelihoods are the primary threat to forests. Um, and I would say, so last summer I got to go to Malawi and we just saw these vast forest areas, zero trees. And it's because of the only fuel available in that re large region of Africa is charcoal, and people are clearing the forest for charcoal. So the forest-dependent livelihoods are a threat to forests in some places. But I also think it's important to say they're not always the biggest threat. Some places they're a minor threat, and some places they're really not a major threat for a variety of reasons. So.
And Forrest, I have one last question for you from V. Arun. I think it's quite a unique question. So when you spoke about why forests, you didn't mention the
Mhm.
home for non-humans. May I know why? You did mention ecology, but what I'm really asking is, isn't it important to bring in the value of a shared home with non-human species, at least to the people living near forests?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I answer that, I did see in the chat someone asked if they could have my contact information, and I don't know if there's a way that we could share my email with people who signed up, but I'd be happy to be in touch with people. I will say that probably the next week or so, I'm working on a grant deadline, so I might not get back for a couple weeks, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to get back. It just means that I have a deadline that I really need to focus on in the next week or two. Um, and maybe Mandeep can facilitate that. He has my contact information. Um, so yeah, okay. Why did I not emphasize a home for non-humans? I would say that there are two reasons, maybe three reasons why I didn't emphasize that. The first is as a person who studies human decision making. I'm primarily interested in the reasons that people make decisions about landscapes. And in most cases, people's decisions about landscapes don't prioritize non-humans. I won't say never, and there's certainly examples in India of people who emphasize the value, people in villages who will talk about the value of wildlife or other non-humans. Um, and but it tends not to be the driving factor of decision making. So I tend to think about it less because it's something I hear about less in my research. Not because I don't personally, I value it a lot and I think it's important, but I don't tend to emphasize it. Um, so non-humans don't make the decisions that lead to the outcomes I'm studying, so I tend not to think about them. And the humans I talk to tend not to emphasize them. And honestly, the second reason, and I gave all these wonderful people I've had the benefit of learning from over the years, and I didn't even mention all of them. And one of the things that's been emphasized to me as an American coming to India. You know, the US has a much lower population density than India, and we have not only a lower population density, but we have large areas of the US that have extremely low population densities. Um, and so we have a culture and a history of thinking a lot about setting aside lands for non-humans. Um, and a lot of Indian ecologists and other people have told me you have to think a little bit differently when you come to India because there's so many people in India, even the the less densely populated areas of India are still very intensively used by people. And so, although wildlife conservation is very important and valuable in India, although non-human play a very important cultural role in India. Um, it's a little bit different. And so I think if I'd been giving this talk in the US, I might have subconsciously worked more of that into it. But I've heard that so much from Indians that I've sort of tried to rethink the way I was raised with these very American ideas of wilderness and vast spaces for non-human nature. Um, and I probably emphasize that less, even though those are important in my own life. But so thanks. That's a really interesting question.
Thank you so much, Forrest. On behalf of all the 108 attendees, at least that was the highest number I spotted, and all the hosts, I think all of us are very grateful that you took the time to give us this talk and also answer so many of the questions. For the attendees, Mandeep has put Dr. Fleischman's email address in the chat, but he has also said that that email address will be shared with the webinar recording. So I don't know how long that usually takes to upload, but give it a few days and hold on to your questions and do share that with Dr. Fleischman. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.